remember the book last month? Were you here last month? That author, she was writing about where I grew up. She grew up in a town about, and I know somebody told me that book, and I was telling her about 30 minutes from where she was growing up. She was the age of one way up the road. South Louisiana. And lots of people in there. My neighbor is John Deere dealer. What about your first job? The first real paycheck job I've had. Summer job. In the downtown area. So can you drive your car? Yeah. Get out, and there I am. I took part of my son. So I asked I don't know. I don't know what to do. But I'm somewhere else. I'm parking after we spend out there, the costing people to park the car. We thought you were coming to tell them that they were in trouble. No. Well, are you kidding? You go to college? Yeah. And then we went back to the city office. All of us that were doing the surveys, and we coded the answers on the sheets. And they probably signed up to the punch cards. That's kind of what I'm thinking. But that was you got to interact with people and you balance all of stuff. I used to be able to, of course, teenagers, like I watch my teenage boys now. They don't hesitate, they don't have that fear. They go, oh yeah, I can do this. We do the RC deal. 5 water bottles at a time. Oh, for goodness sake, put 3 in one hand and you grab the other one like this. And go down. But you don't think about it. But you just learn how to do it. Somebody who's been doing it shows you how to do it. It's not good. It's fun. I bet.
So did any of you change a flat tire in the rain in your first job? I did. Oh, here's another one. Okay. All right. Good afternoon. If any of you are new, this is the Urban Engagement Book Club. And the idea is simple. I read a book, I do my best to pull out the most important stuff, and I tell you what's in it. And then you figure out what that means in your life and in your activity. So that's kind of the purpose of this book club. Gerald Britt over here is the Vice President in charge of public policy, I think is his title. Is that right?
That'll work.
That'll work. For City Square, and we are in this building that is owned by City Square, and I give them $14 every month, and I also give $14 every month to the Equal Justice Initiative. That is the amount that Rosa Parks paid to get out of jail. And so I do that every month. And I want all of you to give $14 to the nonprofit of your choice on December 1, because Rosa Parks was arrested on December 1, 1955. So if you've got extra money, City Square could use it. Okay, we're about to get to the book. I'm taking speaker's privilege, and I thought we'd begin with a poetry reading. And this poem happens to fit with this book, and you may have heard something about this poem in the news in the last few days.
Give me your tired before.
The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So, I will refrain from doing any commentary.
Oh, go ahead.
So the name of the book today is A History of America in 10 Stripes by Erik Loomis. It is a terrific book. And so I've got 3 or 4 things to do before I get to your handout. Item number 1. Today, the fight for equal pay by the U.S. women's soccer team hits a new snag overnight. And so Megan Rapinoe joins us live to discuss the latest over their battle. And what she has said apparently is, well, we're wanting equal pay, and we're not willing to discuss anything less than equal pay, and when they're ready to talk about it, we'll talk about it. So that's news item number 1. News item number 2, people young like you, this is a newspaper. It's delivered to the home. I don't know if any of you ever seen one of those. You have the misfortune of sitting at the front, so I'm sorry. But we still get our physical Dallas Morning News every day. And here it is, yesterday's front page, catering employees stage protest. And to make a long story short, they want to be paid more, and they're not paid what they would have been paid if they had been hired by the companies they work under, but they don't work for those companies because they are contract workers. And I'll be telling you a story about that. Okay? At the top of your handout, I want you to write down something. Write down the words, the South equals non-union. So write that down. And then write this down. Harvard students. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that story because it's not in the handout. During well, what are the worst days of the worker? But during the 19th century, there would be goons and law enforcement. And anybody ever heard of the Pinkerton Detective Agency?
Oh, yeah.
It was actually the Pinkerton Strike-Breaking Agency. And they would beat up people and they would shoot people. Well, it turns out that during that time, and I called a good friend of mine who's a Harvard alum, I said, the book says that Harvard students would go join the beat up the workers crew because they sided with the corporations. Isn't that interesting? That's interesting. And then I did forget something that I should have put in. So turn for just a minute to the inside. Hold on, I've got the wrong version. Here we go. All right. Turn to, here we go. Hold it. Yeah. No. I don't care. Turn to the back. And write down found this phrase, company union. I did not put this anywhere in here, and I should have. And a company union sounds like a labor union, but it isn't. It's a fake labor union. And so they did that. Companies would say, we'll form our own union for the workers, and we'll let them be on the committee. But in reality, they didn't really have any clout. And so I'm going to be blunt, and I know I'm being recorded, but here we go. I thought of that on my drive over as I heard of the discussion on NPR, it may have been the satellite station, about the Endangered Species Act. And the Department of Interior, the secretary who is implementing this taking away the protections for the endangered species. And in case you're wondering, I think we ought to protect all species except Patriots fans. We ought to protect all species. I had forgotten, I'm embarrassed, that his job before he became Secretary of Interior was a lobbyist for the coal industry. And the guy who was commenting on that on NPR said, that is literally the fox protecting the henhouse. So those are some kind of thoughts before we get into it. And so now, if you will turn to the inside back page. We're going to go to the front in a minute. But let's go to the inside back page. I began with a quote that's not in the book, but I certainly thought of it as I read this book. This is from Martin Luther King Jr., letter from Birmingham jail, April 16, 1963. He was in the jail. I've been to the museum where they say they got the bars, but I'm suspicious it's not the real bars. But I've been there, and this is a paragraph from this great letter. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Circle that. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. 8 white clergymen had written a letter to Dr. King saying, we don't appreciate your poorly timed protests in Birmingham. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. And I thought of that quote as I read this book, because I'll tell you now what the book says, and you can leave. Corporations want workers to produce more work faster for less pay in conditions the corporation doesn't care if it's safe or not, and if they don't get exactly what they want, they'll lower the pay. So I tried to summarize what the book says in this box. The owners of corporations are in business to make money, as much money as possible. One way they do that is to get the most work, more and more work. Anybody remember the I Love Lucy candy assembly line? That's really pretty accurate. I mean, they would demand more productivity in shorter time. So more and more work out of the people they employ at the lowest possible cost. This has led to great abuse of workers and great exploitation of workers. This book chronicles the efforts of the workers to make more in better working conditions. It is not an easy struggle. And then one other item from my past before I get to the actual content of the book. I did my graduate work in communication, rhetoric, and public address at the University of Southern California. I studied the rhetoric of social movements. And I read a lot of articles and textbooks and books and speeches. And so here's what the rhetoric and then the actions of social movements reveal to us. You first ask for what you want. Hey, could we have restroom breaks? Could we get a cup of water? And I'm now reading, when words don't work, actions follow. All right, we're going to sit down in the job, or we're going to strike. And when actions don't work, violence follows. And when violence arrives, and this is worth noting, along with alliances with any group that might help. One of the real discussions in this book about the labor union history is this idea: how come so many labor union leaders were communists? It's because the capitalists wouldn't listen to their requests. And they found solidarity with groups that we generally don't like. But the reality is that in part of the 19th century and early 20th century up through the middle 20th century, labor leaders were very much connected in one way or another to different groups of communists. And even at some point with anarchists. But this is the explanation for it. We learned that this is what happened when I was in graduate school. And there's a very famous article that I read. Anybody old enough to remember the protests on college campuses about the Vietnam War? Well, at one point they took over the University of California administration building, and they gave speeches, and they used pretty blunt profanity. And the article said, when you hear a speaker using blunt profanity, that is a signal that they have not been listened to earlier. And so that was interesting. Okay. So here we go. I'm walking through this page. We'll go to the front in a few minutes. What do you pay a custodian? And the answer is as little as possible. And so this story, which is relatively late in the book, kind of captures the whole story. In 1990, at Century City in Los Angeles, a big high-rise building owned by a company got rid of all their custodians, who were making about $12 an hour. And then they hired a company who would bring in custodial workers. So it was an outside company. They outsourced the cleaning of the building to the company, and that company hired part-time contract workers. And so the workers who were cleaning the building went from people getting $12 an hour to people getting $4.30 an hour. That was the adjustment.
And no benefits.
Pardon me?
And no benefits.
And no benefits, that's correct. And so, 1990, so they had a strike, and the Los Angeles police beat the workers and used the threat of guns. This is not 1890, this is 1990. So that's kind of a story that captures the struggle. Let me talk about the idea of going viral. Have you seen any videos that went viral in recent time? Have you seen the one about, what's his name? What's that fighter? What is his name? It's today. It's Conor McGregor.
Yeah.
He apparently hit an older guy in a bar, and it's caught on video. It's all over Twitter right now. Conor McGregor can handle any older guy. So anyway, there had been large groups of people die in worker accidents because of poor conditions in mines especially. There had been groups uptime, some 1 or 2 times up to 250 to 300 that had died in the mines. The book mentions Upton Sinclair, the jungle, and the people who worked in the meat packing. And they would work with electricity in the building and water, and it would not be uncommon for somebody almost regularly to step in the water and get electrocuted and die. And it would be very cold, and it wasn't kept warm, and their hands were frozen, and they would cut off their fingers. And frozen meat would hit them in the head and kill them. But something happened that went viral. And what happened was, in 1911, in Manhattan, there was a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. If you've never heard about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, it was a big deal. These women who were making shirtwaists, which is an old kind of undergarment for women, they were locked in the room, padlocked, so that they wouldn't take a break. It was an upstairs room. This was common practice. And so a fire broke out. They could not get out of the room. They broke the windows and jumped down from the upper window. They jumped to their death. 145 women died. So even though that wasn't as many people that died in other accidents as workers, it was in Manhattan. And people saw it. It went viral before things could go viral. And they changed the laws, and it became against the law to lock people in a room that was upstairs. So those are some of the things that are mentioned in this book. And then there's quite a story, oh boy, this is interesting, of Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan and the air traffic controllers. For those of you who don't remember, Ronald Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers because they were on strike. And the irony, and I did not remember this part of the story, is that the air traffic controller union endorsed Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter. They did that because Jimmy Carter had not been favorable enough to unions. And then Ronald Reagan disbanded, fired the union, got rid of the union. And I'm jumping ahead, but when Jimmy Carter was president, 20-point-something% of the American workforce were members of unions. Reagan began the downward spiral, and it's now at 10.1%. So 1/2 the union membership that was there when Jimmy Carter was president, which is still below what it was in its heyday. Okay? This book is a critique of capitalism. And boy, I'm living in Dallas, and I do book presentations to business people, and the idea of critiquing capitalism in some of my audiences would not go over well. But here's a quote from the book. Capitalism is an economic system developed to create private profits that has led to the income inequality that defines modern society. And it has. And it really has. Okay? We went from new unions, 19th century primarily, to many unions, to many union members, to now fewer union members, fewer strikes, fewer unions. And so we are truly at a low point right now in union membership. This is a quote from the book. As of 2017, only 10.7% of workers are union members. In 1983, Reagan is president. When Phelps Dodge decided to crush its unions, that number stood at 20.1%. So 50% are gone. It's useful as you study the history of unions, and I'm just a book reader, so I'm no real expert, but here are some things that I learned. There are strikes, that is one union, one group withholds their work against one company. There are general strikes, and that's bigger. many groups joining in, and it's affecting many more companies. And we've got a speaker afterwards. If I get any of this wrong, correct me. There are wildcat strikes. I did not know what this meant. They don't throw wildcats into the company. Wildcat strikes is an unauthorized strike. In other words, the union didn't vote on it and say, let's go on strike. A bunch of the people just said, we're going to go on strike. And there are scab workers, workers who work against the strike. They cross the picket line of the strike. And then I want you to write down a phrase that I should have included. There are sit-downs. Yeah. And there was a really big story in the book about one of the auto companies where the workers just sat down. And they were there. And they weren't working. And there are a number of advantages to that over a strike where you're outside. If you're sitting in the place, other folks can't come in and do the work. And if they do attack you, they might ruin the machinery. So sit-downs were effective at one point. Okay. Now, what I've got here is kind of a quick summary of all the bad stuff that happened. So what used to be? First, child labor. It turns out that in the 19th century, corporations used children in the worst ways imaginable, just like we read today in sweatshops in other countries. And I mean child labor was rampant. There were many, many, many sex workers constantly abused. I once took a class on the history of cities. It was at, I think it was El Camino College in Los Angeles. It was a very good junior college. I just wanted to learn. And the professor said, you know, we don't teach this real well, but basically in every new town, the first thing that would open would be the brothel. And then I'll never forget it, he said, what did you exactly think that Miss Kitty and Gunsmoke was doing? So I've never forgotten that. But it turns out that there is a real long history of abuse of women as sex workers, and this book chronicles some of them. All right, the work day in many places in the 19th century was 14 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week. And then they wanted it to come down to 12, and then they wanted it to come down to 10. And of course, ultimately, they wanted the 8-hour workday. And what the corporations did was, they would bring it down to 10, but they would dock your pay. So you didn't make the same amount of money as they reduced your hours. And so that was common. Very unsafe working conditions. I mean, no protection, people breathing toxic fumes, people working, cutting their fingers off. I mean, this book is filled with those stories. If you don't know this word, they had company scrip and company housing and company store. And so on payday, you would be given a piece of paper that said you have X number of dollars in company money, company scrip. And you couldn't spend it at McDonald's. You had to spend it at the company store. And if you live in company housing, they might raise your rent and not raise your pay. I mean, these people deserve innovation medals for how they cheated people. I'm kidding. Nobody in this book deserves much of a medal. Some people did. And so that's the script idea. Company housing, company store. Brutal treatment of workers. Worker group set against worker group, especially by race and gender. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Brutal, deadly treatment of people going on strike. By company enforcers, by hired enforcers, Pinkerton Detective Agency, even government agencies and law enforcement. So there were lots of deaths and murders, and especially of African American workers, lots of lynchings. Lots of lynchings. Basically, you would beat somebody or you would lynch somebody to tell the others, you better straighten up. Do not underestimate the impact of racism or gender bias or all bias. Okay, look at the next page and look at the top. First came slaves. Let me pause here a minute. One of the books we did in this room, I think a year or so ago, was called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. It won a Pulitzer Prize. It is a remarkable book. And today, in the New York Times Magazine, at least that's when I first saw it, there is one of these gigantic, enormous essays that you need a vacation to read, written by Matthew Desmond, on how the white plantation created the systems of capitalism. And it is a fascinating essay. I've only dipped into it. But what it basically says is, you remember when people borrowed all the money in toxic loans in 2007 and we had the crash in 2008? Well, that happened with plantation owners who borrowed money against their slaves, and the value of the slaves went down and the whole system crashed. It's a great article. So first came slaves, and then immigrants. And basically, all of this story is about how corporations don't want to pay the money that would be required to pay white male workers, so we'll bring in slaves. We'll bring in immigrants. And I don't have all of the quotes in the handout, but in World War II, the white men went to war. Rosie the Riveter showed up to build the bullets and the planes, along with African American workers, and they wanted to keep working, and when they did keep working, the white men coming back made, $50 for a paycheck, and the women earned $30 for a paycheck, doing the same work. So first came slaves, and then immigrants, and then outsourcing. We're going to send this to Mexico or China, and then contract workers. And what's next? Corporations will find ways to pay less for needed work, full stop. So I realize that you're saying, Randy, isn't there a corporate response to this book? There's not one in this book. And so this is a book about the worker, the labor unions. But I got to tell you, it's pretty compelling, because I know enough of the history to know that companies all over are hiring contract workers to avoid paying salaries and giving benefits. Okay, here is what I would say to workers. Workers, from reading this book, workers really need to choose their labor leaders well. There was a great labor leader. He spoke at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He helped organize it. His name was Walter Reuther. He was a great labor leader. Died in 1970 in a plane crash. May have been sabotage. Don't know. The leaders that followed were not as social justice, poverty-oriented as Walter Reuther. So one of the things this book says, without saying it, is you better choose your labor leaders well, and you better choose a political party to get really behind, to get your folks elected, because that's a big deal. If you get the wrong people in office, they will side completely with corporate interests. Okay, turn to the front, and we're going to really fly through this chart. Why is this book worth our time? Number one, this book provides a different take on the economic history of the United States. It's a take worth reading. Number two, this book provides a strong criticism of the dark side of capitalism. It is a thought-provoking critique. And number 3, this book is a reminder that the struggles for equality in every way are real and ongoing. Now, I'm not going to read many of the highlights. I don't have time. When you see one in bold, I put it in bold, and when you see it in bigger font, I did that. So you want to read at least on your own the bold and the bigger font ones, and there are, I don't know, 83 highlights. I'm going to read just a few. Keep your eyeballs moving with me. Look at number 6. Class struggle, framed through transformations in capitalism, through other struggles for racial and gendered justice, and through changes in American politics and society, has played a central role in American history. This book places the struggle for worker justice at the heart of American history. And it really, I mean, for example, it says one of the biggest strikes in history, one of the biggest general strikes in history, was when all of the enslaved people just rushed to the Union general and said, "I'll help you." And there's a story in here about specific plantation owners and the enslaved people running to the north side. And so they quit doing their work, and that helped the South lose the war. So interesting. All right, turn to page 2, number 17. There is simply no evidence from American history that unions can succeed if the government and employers combine to crush them. You've got to get the right people elected. All right, number 25, and again, I'm skipping a lot. A better tomorrow is possible, but only if you demand it. All right, number 38 on page 3. This is kind of around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. The courts consistently found in favor of the new corporations, claiming those businesses promoted progress in the justification for the court's decisions. This led to corporations with the right to pollute at will, and timber companies with the right to destroy the stream banks that farmers owned, with courts backing up corporate domination of anyone who got in the way of their growth. I don't have this down anywhere in here, but I should have put it in. This is what he's saying. Basically, the argument of the corporations and the argument of the courts was that everything they were doing was their private property. And of course, when they were actually enslaved people, they were property. And so they basically kept wanting to view workers as though they were slaves. So really sad and interesting. Okay, turn to page 5. I'm about out of time. Number 75, more money and better working conditions can only happen with a union. And this is what GM refused to grant. This is during a sit-down strike, I think, in Flint. And that is what the workers refused to live without. Number 83 on page 6. If we are to win back our rights, we have to win in the political realm. One of the major parties has to become the Workers' Party in order for us to win our rights. Larry James, the CEO of City Square, will tell you, benevolence and philanthropy is great, but you got to have government work to help tackle poverty. Same with unions. All right, turn to the back. I've got 7 lessons and takeaways. Number 1, the system of capitalism is set up to exploit workers. It is. It's set up to exploit workers. We need to recognize this reality. Number 2, though there may be rare exceptions, workers will not be protected, paid well, treated well by corporations voluntarily. Therefore, there must be robust, truly enforced government help on behalf of workers. There's a lot in the book about government bills and laws being passed and the companies ignoring them. Number 3, workers have done best when there were strong unions plus government help. Circle that one, that's critical. Number 4, solidarity. Solidarity among all workers is essential to bring about workers' progress for any workers. The unions and the corporations would kind of say, we're preferring our white workers to get ahead. We don't care about the black workers. I mean, it was racism within the unions as well as from the corporations. Number 5, a loss is no time for workers to give up hope. A loss requires even more organizing. This is a long game. But number 6, put a star beside number 6. There are multiple stories in the book where a win by workers is not a signal to quit organizing. They would win something and then they just quit paying union dues and back away. And so the next battle is coming for sure, probably faster than the workers realize. This is a long game. And number 7, though this book only hints at it, and it does hint at it at the end, things are only going to get worse because of the rise of automation. Now, one footnote. You see the table of contents just above it? Circle number 5, the bread and roses strike. I just love the imagery. It was women involved, and they said, we want enough money to buy bread and roses, sustenance and joy. That's what makes for life. So that's a great phrase. Well, there it is. A History of America in 10 Strikes by Erik Loomis. Hope you found it useful. Thank you.